of bringing up my longtime friend and colleague, Peter Petrie, who is going to do a great session on how the work environment is changing with a terrific group of panelists. So I'm just going to turn it right over to Peter, with whom I spent 25 years at Fortune magazine.
Thank you, David. Well, in a way, we've already started the conversation on our topic, which you see here, and that's simply a multi-adjective way of explaining how this subject of the nature of work and the future of work has blown up like a giant dust storm and is taking over much of the conversation. We've already spent time on it this morning. So please, my panelists have not, where are my panelists? Arun can go up. Okay, Arun, please join me.
All right.
Okay, so
we could just make it a conversation.
well, that's exactly right. Yeah. So well, let me introduce Arun since he's here.
Sometimes when I get on stage, the rest of the panel just decides that there's no point joining.
It's enough. Yeah. You get enough with just Arun. So.
Okay, so Arun Sundararajan is of the NYU Business School. He's one of the world's leading experts on how digital technology transforms business, government, and society. And he actually wrote the book. He wrote the book on the sharing economy, on platform, Lyft, Airbnb, TaskRabbit. It's a book called The Sharing Economy, and I commend it to you. Deanna Farrell was the head of the McKinsey Global Institute in the early 2000s. And then when the Great Recession hit and Barack Obama was elected, she was recruited to the White House as a top advisor on economic policy during the crisis years from 2009 to 2011. And now she's the founding head and CEO of the JP Morgan Chase Institute. So welcome, Deanna. And Andrea Glorioso is the European Union's liaison to Washington on internet and data and communications policy. He's expert in intellectual property and IT law and data security. And what this means is that Andrea has a unique dual perspective on not only this weird workaholic madhouse we call the United States, but also technology and labor in the EU. And we're going to go to Andrea for some perspective. But the way I want to start out is we've talked about labor a little bit in both the conversations you've heard so far this morning, but I want to step back and set the big context, which is that since the Great Recession here in the US economy has seen more than 80 months of job growth, more than 80 months. And the economy is actually now near what the Fed likes to call full employment, which is like 4.2%. So taken that way, the picture looks really positive. And the two questions I want to start our discussion with today is, one, during this time of recovery from the recession, what have we learned about technology and jobs in the future of work? And two, what are the numbers that we're hearing not telling us? So Andrea, I'm sorry, I'm going to start with Deanna because one thing I forgot to mention is in the backs of your magazines, you will find an article by Deanna about some of the statistical work that the JP Morgan Chase Institute is doing, and this will dovetail with that. So Deanna, please.
Great, thank you. Let me start with that. I think we all were very surprised as economists about kind of the narrative that was out there in general, that the economy was the driver of a lot of the anxiety that voted for change and otherwise, because according to most of the traditional measures, you mentioned unemployment, but also in the last couple of years, finally, we've actually seen pretty healthy income growth, which has been a new phenomenon. We've seen the concern around labor force participation abate a little bit, the concern around long-term unemployment abate a little bit. And so as an economist, you could sit and wonder, what is the disconnect? And I think some of the work that we've done really informs that question in an important way. So what we have is anonymized, obviously, a window into people's financial inflows and outflows. So think about their income coming in, their expenses coming out, and we get to track this on a high-frequency basis, which is what the aggregate data don't tell you. So over a period of time, if you...
So high frequency means like every time I pull out my Chase credit card, That's the frequency.
That's the frequency. We don't monitor, we're usually doing things on a monthly basis. But yes, that would be, in effect, the raw data coming in. But if you survey people and you ask them, do you prefer income growth or stability, whether you're talking about Pew or CFSI or any number of people who track this, they'll all say people much favor stability over income growth. So what do we find when we put a lens on people's income and expenses? We find extraordinary levels of volatility. And so month to month, 55% of Americans are seeing a potential swing of up to 30% in their income or 30% in their expenses. Now, that is really hard to grapple when you just look at aggregate year-on-year data. And that's what you begin to understand about the anxiety that people feel because their income is often moving in ways different than expenses. In a traditional way, they don't co-vary. If your income dropped and your expenses dropped with it, maybe not such a big problem. But in fact, we see income drops at the same time that we see very large increases in expenses. And the result is, if you think of it as a stress test on households are often left without a liquid buffer to withstand that volatility, and that's a source of huge anxiety. The paper that you mentioned, Peter, in the economy piece today, which is really a very nice collection of articles, focuses on expense volatility. So 4 out of 10, let me say one more thing about the volatility issue. People who track low-income communities have been talking about this for a long time, that low-income people get in a lot of trouble because they have a liquidity trap.
It's paycheck to paycheck, too.
Exactly, paycheck to paycheck. I think our findings were surprising in that this is true for all Americans. Quintiles 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all are facing this kind of volatility.
So let me interrupt you. What does that mean? That people don't have jobs anymore? And this kind of leads into something I wanted to ask Arun to talk about.
Well, no, I think people do have jobs, but they're any combination of different work schedules that lead to different hours worked, the way the calendar works, that some months have 5 Fridays, some months have 4 Fridays, but people get paid on a biweekly level, creates volatility. Tax refunds can create positive volatility, but again, volatility that doesn't always get matched with expense kind of discipline. So people still have jobs. You mentioned the unemployment rate. For those people who are seeking jobs, they have jobs. People are supplementing traditional jobs with gig economy type of jobs. And our work, which focuses primarily on the online platform economy, would note that for most people, that isn't their primary source of income. Most people are really just supplementing their income through that. But the nature of work is changing. So I think too much of the discussion, even earlier this morning, was focused on the binary question of will we have jobs or not jobs. I share the optimism that we will have jobs, but there's no question that the nature of jobs is changing and that this volatility point I talked about is here to stay. It's not going to go away. If anything, it's probably going to be exacerbated as we move towards independent work and other mechanisms.
So Arun, you recently made a comment to me that really stuck in my head. You said we are quickly shifting to a non-job world. What does that mean? Well,
it essentially means that if you look at the work that is being created today, a significant fraction of it is not as what we'd recognize as whole jobs, right? I mean, there've been a number of studies over the last year, actually, that have tried to quantify the extent to which work in the United States is organized as non-employment work arrangements.
And that would mean non-W-2 kinds of jobs?
Yeah, no, non-full-time jobs.
Non-full-time, okay.
And so this is part-time work, this is temp work, this is freelancers, this is entrepreneurs of one.
So-called contingent work.
Yep, I prefer the term non-employment work simply because there's a there's a polarity associated with the word contingent that it sort of takes the conversation in a particular direction in my head. Because this could be a good thing. Right, but if you actually look at the statistics, and McKinsey has done work on this, the Freelancers Union has done work on this, the Rand Institute ran a survey for Alan Kruger at Princeton, Manpower
We have done work on this.
JP Morgan Chase has done work on this. And you look at that picture and then you sort of tie it with the Bureau of Labor Statistics data and the census data on the creation of non-employee corporations, the entity that someone often creates when they're entrepreneur of one. You find that there's anywhere from 45 to 65 million people in the United States out of a civilian workforce of 160 million. So somewhere in the 25 to over 40% of the workforce is getting all or part of their income from non-employment work. One of Kruger's findings was that almost all of the job creation that we've accomplished in the last 15 years was through non-employment work arrangements. And so what it means is that the only part of this are platforms like Airbnb, platforms like Uber and Lyft, platforms like Upwork. This is just a small slice of technology's effect on reorganizing work. I think that there's a broader shift that has occurred that has resulted in a significant fraction of how we organize work and how we organize new work in particular being arranged in non-job forms. And so, and then this sort of comes full circle to, I guess, the point that Fred made earlier today about these statistics not sort of measuring what we need them to. I think nowhere is that more salient than in the employment statistics. There's a whole bunch of invisible work that we're not picking up on.
I mean, I found it absolutely amazing that in the last 10 years, there's evidence that virtually all the net employment growth in the United States is in the form of these non-job jobs. All of it, all the growth. So, and I want to come back to the slice that the gig economy accounts for.
Yeah.
But let me turn to Andrea. Jobs have been growing in the EU as well, and the economies have been recovering. I think there's 50 months of job growth now in the EU. Unemployment is down, but still at levels, depending where you are, Germany, twice as high as here in the US, other places 3 to 5 times as high. So I just wonder, is the nature and composition of work, what can you tell us about how the nature and composition of work is changing in the EU? Is it mirroring what's happening here in the US, or are you seeing other greater forces at work?
Well, before I try to get to that point, let me make, if I may, a slightly broader point, which I think that the kind of research that we're talking about here, the research that JP Morgan has been doing and others, is hugely important. I cannot underline how important it is because, the old joke that there are lies, then lies, and statistics in order of... now, statistics are very important, and economic analysis is essential. We need it, but sometimes those big aggregate numbers tend to hide the reality at the micro level, which is ultimately the reality that people live through. So understanding, I'm personally not surprised given the country I come from, Italy, and the kind of economic transformation that I saw firsthand. I'm not surprised at all to see that people, even in the US, they value stability of income much more than the level of income I have. I think it's also quite normal because by and large, notwithstanding what they might say during election times, human beings, all human beings, we do not like change very much. We are not wired for change, and our brain is still, by and large, the brain of hundreds of thousands of years ago when we evolved from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. Change, most of the times, means danger. It's something that you don't know, and what you don't know can kill you. And we have come a long way, but still our brain works in that way. And there has been this mythology, if I may use perhaps a bit of a strong word, certainly this narrative about how disruption and disruptive innovation is great. But let's face it, and let's be very honest about it, very few people outside of certain bubbles in the US or Europe actually like disruption in their lives. So I think it's very important to recognize that. And by the way, I'm not in any way form discounting the importance of technological change, the positive effects of technological change, and in a way the fact that I don't believe in techno-determinism. I don't think that we should just raise our hands and say, well, technology is coming, we can't do anything about it. I don't believe in that. But technology puts pressure on society, and we need to be able to steer that pressure and those changes. Now, the situation in Europe is indeed very diverse, depending on the member states that we're talking about. So the situation in Germany is pretty good, certainly compared to the start of the financial crisis. The situation in Greece or in Italy, my home country, and others is not that good, let's put it that way. I think there, as a European living in the US since 3 years, as you said, I think I have become too American for my European colleagues, and I'm still too European for my American counterparts sometimes. But I do get the perspective. With all due respect, I think that the numbers that we see coming from the US, and I don't mean this as a political criticism either to the previous administration or the current administration. As a diplomat, I don't have political opinions unless my superiors tell me that I need to have one.
From talking to you, I happen to know you have lots of personal opinions.
I have many personal opinions, but that's not my job as a diplomat. The numbers that we see from the US, I think they don't tell the whole story, not only in terms of the actual stability that people expect, but also that, let's face it, and I can offer only anecdotal evidence, but if you have invested tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to get a higher education, whether it's a master's degree or even a PhD, and you end up working at a fast food joint, and with all due respect to fast food workers, but that's more common than people think. Yes, you're employed. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good match for your skills, for your investments.
Okay. Let me just take the temperature of the audience here. How many people here have a job in the classical sense? I want to get a proportion. I'm keeping my hand down. I'm a gig worker. How many people cobble together an income from multiple gigs or are entrepreneurs? So that's probably half and half. Now, those of you with young millennial children, how many of your kids have jobs? Okay, there's a handful. And how many of your millennials are patching together the kind of livelihood like we heard Fred Wilson talking about earlier today? So what I'm seeing is about 50-50 in both generations, which is pretty interesting. This is a massive shift that we're here in the middle of. Now, I'm going to come back to Arun. A couple of weeks ago, Arun teamed up, and the NYU Business School teamed up with McKinsey and ran an entire day-long conference on the subject of the future of work. So there were some really interesting takeaways from that. And tell me the one thing that surprised you the most in what you heard people say at your conference.
Oh, that's a tough one. The one thing that surprised me the most. Okay,
well, you can say two if there are two.
Well, this is going to be not so interesting for Diana since she was one of our panelists. Well, I guess.
Well, what Diana said was one of the most interesting.
I was going to say,
I'm gonna, like, by far the most interesting thing that was said at the panel, at the conference was by Diana, but I'm going to let her cover that after I finish answering my question. But I think that there was a discussion about specialization and the effects that specialization have on the organization of work. And the observation was as follows, which was that, over the last 50 or 60 years, work has become increasingly specialized. Now, as work gets more specialized, it becomes harder to organize it as full-time jobs. And I think the example given was in movie special effects, how the movie studio would have a few people on staff, employed full-time, but now special effects, you need 1,000 different capabilities. So the only way to sort of get what you need is to get it on demand when you need it. So that's certainly sort of one insight. And another theme that emerged was around if artificial intelligence and robotics technologies, at whatever pace that they do, start to do many of the things that human beings do today to earn a living. Where will the job creation come from? Where will the work creation come from?
Yeah, that's a theme that's come up earlier today.
Yeah, and after the conference, I was sort of pulling some themes together, and it seems like a couple of threads stood out. One was the formalizing of sectors of the economy that used to be informal. 200 years ago, healthcare didn't exist as an industry. It was done, but it was done informally. And now this industry has been formalized. 100 years ago, you'd visit your grandparents if you got vacations. Now tourism accounts for 8% of global employment. And the other is the creation of work that better fulfills human aspirations that are underfulfilled right now. We're not as well educated as we want to be. We're not as well taken care of. We're not as entertained as we want to be. And so, I think a lot of the fear of job loss from technological progress comes from this fallacy that somehow there's a fixed amount of work to be done. And that, once machines start doing it, and, this is a 200-year-old fallacy. The Luddite rebellions, in part, were sort of responding to this feeling of, what will humans do? Mm-hmm. But just I think we began to unpack where will the work creation come from.
There was also an interesting fear voiced by one of the McKinsey authors of the McKinsey studies that said they were more worried that automation would not happen fast enough. And, we heard that with respect to Japan in particular, but also in the United States. But Diana,
I wanted to just connect a dot with something about how people have not fully absorbed many of these changes, and they're hard to understand. It relates back to the anxiety point. One of the data assets that we are building is really trying to understand a place-based view of the economy. Mm-hmm. So rather than what's happening at the national level, let's take a lens into New York City or LA or Chicago and just monitor what's happening in that world. Now, if you follow retail, the Merchant Retail Trade Survey, or you follow the Services Survey, you follow this, what you see is actually pretty kind of healthy growth. It's 2%, 3%, 4%, depending on the quarter. But by and large, you'd sort of scratch your head and say, why is this anxiety at the local level that connects partly to income volatility? It has another element. If you do what we do, which is we track every debit and credit card swipe that we see in each of these cities, and we map that across age of consumer, income of consumer, the products that are being bought, the merchant size, the most stark thing is that since 2015, we've had a deceleration in what we call local consumer commerce. Why is that? It's in large part because where the retail sales and service sales are growing like crazy is online. And
Amazon.
Not just Amazon, although Amazon's part, there are many marketplaces that are playing this role. And for many of us, like me, guilty as charged, who get on these platforms to buy things, it's more convenient, it's lower price often, et cetera. It's having a very significant effect on what's happening in local economies. So just as you were saying that some of the specialization and ways in which people are fulfilling their roles and their skills with work are taking a whole new dimension, how we think about commerce and the relationships that get established through commerce that build communities is undergoing a very dramatic change. And that's what people are responding to a lot. And certainly in what we heard before, inside the country where the people don't feel as connected online and otherwise, all they see is the decimation of what's happening in their local communities.
And in many ways, I mean, this underscores one of the big policy challenges that we're going to face over the next 20 years. Because the company has been a really important community organization in the United States.
And local commerce has been too, right?
Yes. And as we start to sort of decouple productive work from an institution and define a different kind of individual-institution relationship. And I think the platform economy does, represent part of this. I think it's sort of showing us the way in terms of, the dizzying array of sort of different kinds of individual-institution relationships that might exist. I mean, the relationship between an Etsy seller and the platform or an Airbnb host and the platform is there's some economic dependence, but it's very different from an employee-employer relationship.
Yeah, and you've actually described this whole gig platform economy as kind of a giant experiment where there are thousands of different variations, and no one quite knows what kind of technology will turn out to be most helpful and what will be most undermining of society.
But I would underscore Andreas's point, which is that despair would come in the form of, we have no way of shaping this. We, through policy, through activism, through otherwise, have ways of shaping these platforms to go in one direction or another. And I think that's really essential. I would argue that a lot of Silicon Valley, Jillian in the previous discussion mentioned they're living in a bit of a bubble around what's going on. Yes, and moreover, they have to own, as part of their responsibility of agents in society, kind of some of these changes and help rebuild communities in different ways. So you mentioned the platforms. It's true that they're destroying communities in some ways, but like an Etsy creates communities too.
Yes.
No, it's just that it's like
Right.
the shape of where you're going to get your community from changes. Like, you don't go to work every day and meet the same people, but you're part of a host community or a seller community or a driver community or a lawyer community if you're on one of the legal platforms, or a consultant community if you're one of the consulting platforms, because, this is, this form of work is not just in accommodation, selling stuff online, transportation. It's moving to the professional services as well. Right. And to your point, Diana, about policy shaping sort of the outcomes, I mean, one of the core arguments of my book is really that we have to sort of come up with policy that shifts outcomes in a way that decentralizes the ownership of capital. It's really going to be problematic if we decouple work from an institution, but people are simply providers of talent and labor, because that's not sustainable. At some point, the AI and robotics technologies are going to lower wages if you're merely a provider of labor and talent. But if we somehow decentralize the ownership of capital, if you're running a tiny business through the platform, that gives you sort of like, much better insurance against these sort of changes that are coming.
One of the most interesting remarks I've heard you say is that you've been getting lots of calls lately from labor unions.
Yeah.
Can you explain why they're calling you?
Well, I think that organized labor is an important part of maintaining the bargaining power of labor. The way labor organized in the 50s and 60s was optimized for the way work was arranged at the time. It's not optimized for the way work is arranged today. And so both from a point of view of saying, how do we construct a safety net that is well suited for people who are not in full-time employment roles, but also how do we reimagine, the collective of individuals who might be running small businesses instead of working full-time, who might be freelancers instead of working full-time. How do we reimagine that collective to sort of prepare ourselves?
If I may reinforce Arun's point, I think that this is an incredibly important point. The role of labor unions. I would say this is a personal opinion, it's not a European Union position. In Italy and in some other countries, just to be clear what comes from me and what comes from my superiors. But in Italy and other countries, labor unions in many ways have failed the new generation of workers, the younger generation of workers. They have not been able to provide the kind of platforms, the kind of protection, the kind of bargaining representation that workers in the 50s, the 60s, again, as Arun said, optimized for a certain kind of employee-employee relationship, mostly in the factory, on the factory floor, kind of very much Fordist settings. And they have lost a lot of trust among younger generation. I mean, if I talk to people who are in their 20s or 30s, almost nobody is part of a labor union, certainly not in Italy and other countries. And that's a real danger because, let's face it, I'm personally not a Marxist or a socialist, but business pressure and the natural market makes it so that employers will always try to maximize profits. And if you don't have on the other side some form of organized bargaining position, that's going in the mid to long term, even the short term, I would say, that's going to be a real issue for workers. And by the way, all these workers, given these pesky environments in which luckily we all live, which are called democracies, which are the worst possible systems of them all, except every other system that we ever tried, these workers vote. And there are different reasons why people vote the way they vote, but let's face it, in many cases, people are not that much interested into the very ethereal discussion about artificial intelligence, about all of this stuff. They're interested to know, will I get a fair living? Will I get security in my life? Will I get a job? And if we don't manage to get an answer to this collective, an answer to this question, I'm afraid, again, personal opinion, that the kind of voting that we will see in the next years will not go in a sustainable democratic direction.
In some
Can I
ways-
touch on this? Because it's really important to the future of work and how we think about that. It's not about having jobs or not having jobs. I think that's the wrong question. It's about how we structure the tasks that need to be completed and the safety nets and systems around them. And in the US, where I would know the situation better, where the unions failed, I would argue, is by doubling down on the notion that the safety net would be attached to the employer.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so it was all company union employees. And there were some, you'll remember in the early offshoring days when David and I first met, that Andy Stern and others, he was at the head of the SEIU, the Services Employee International Union, was arguing for a shift away from this employer-based model to a different platform.
Yeah.
And it connects to another issue with what is wrong with the numbers looking so good and people feeling so bad, is that our safety net isn't evolving in the same way. So
Yeah, one of the most interesting developments has been the wild growth of the freelancers union.
well,
Kind of came
yeah,
out of
but
nowhere, but which is essentially insurance, a kind of insurance that's
and
not
yeah,
provided anywhere else for
and
workers.
portable benefits. I mean,
Yeah.
Sarah Horowitz will talk about how one of the things they're in the business of providing health insurance to their union members. So I think that's actually moving in the right direction, for sure. But I would point to another one, which is really important because often policy gets written off as stuff for poor people, and therefore gets put in a camp that most people in a room like this wouldn't really care about. But unemployment insurance is a very different thing. Most Americans will tap unemployment insurance at one form or another, including middle class and upper middle
I
class
mean, like
people.
people in this room even?
Some people in this room will, if they haven't already, will. But here's the really important thing to know about unemployment insurance. Most jobs are, because of the dynamics you describe, Arun, less and less eligible for unemployment insurance. Why? Because you have to have a payroll. You have to have the same job for X number of months, if not years, depending on the state. You have to have, a W-2 form. You have to do, et cetera. So fewer and fewer people can avail themselves of this really valuable safety net that works really well. And we've documented just how well this staves off the loss of income and the shift in employment in these event studies that you'll see.
I mean,
for
just
example.
look at the way that it's labeled, right? It's called unemployment insurance, and so
Right,
it is
exactly.
the alternative to employment.
But let me finish. So more and more people are not availing themselves because they can't. And what we find is even those people for whom their jobs are technically eligible, only about 25 or 30% are actually accessing it because states are putting very high requirements or onerous eligibility issues. So what is the next unemployment insurance policy that will help the growing, changing world? That's been a very effective policy, but it's deteriorating in its capacity to help.
And I just
No,
want to
let
come
me
back.
just- I'm going to open this up to so people be thinking questions. I'm going to, right after Arun makes a remark, I'll ask for one. But I do want to also throw in one other topic that I feel really obliged to get on the table. And that's kind of this, there are several utopian fantasies about work that have cropped up that I'm completely fascinated by. And I just want to mention, because I'll bet other people in this room are too, one of them is, comes from Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote *Sapiens*, who recently did a brilliant piece in The Guardian where he speculated about a future in which jobs go away because of automation. And his question is, what are we going to do with all of our time? And he spins a fantasy of what he calls non-work, which is either religion or art or multi-user games. So I just want to throw that out as one fantasy.
Okay.
The other great fantasy, which is a very Silicon Valley way of looking at this whole unemployment issue, is the minimum guaranteed,
Basic
the
universal-
basic universal income, which is intellectually a beautiful solution that people like to talk about, and that tends to end the conversation right there. But it's a nice fantasy to note, at least in the context of this discussion. Anyway, please, Arun.
Well, I just wanted to bring it back full circle to where Diana started us off on, which was the observation that there is far greater volatility in people's lives on the income front. I think that that's a thread that's going to persist I think that we've ignored transition education for the last 40 years as manufacturing has been automated, and some of the political outcomes that we've seen are a reaction to the fact that there is a slice of people who used to be employed well who don't have that kind of opportunity, and we focus a lot of education on early career rather than career transition. So that's one form of volatility, like sort of the shift in your work. But it's more a question of the stability that we all aspire to, income stability, job, sort of what you're doing stability, community stability. It all came from one source in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And to me, reconstructing the social safety net has certainly to do with smoothing income streams through unemployment insurance, earned income tax credit, basic income as an extreme. But it also has to do with smoothing volatility on other fronts of people's lives, because that's what the safety net, or that's what the social contract
That's what humans need, yes.
Peter,
Okay, questions?
Peter,
Anyone,
if I may, just 30 seconds.
yes.
Yeah.
Mike Handler, be ready?
Yes, just because you mentioned universal basic income, and you seemed, unless I misunderstood, you seem to associate it mostly with Silicon Valley. I would just like to point out that actually reflections on universal basic income are much older than even the existence of Silicon Valley. Sorry to toot my own horn here, but they were actually started, as far as I can see, in the neo-Marxist schools of political scientists in my own alma mater, actually, in Padua, as a reaction to the analysis at the time of the evolution of modern capitalism. And the idea at the time was that because our lives was so and so used as a source of revenue for capital, even with advertising on television, we became a product, then it was just fair that as citizens we would get an income no matter what we did. Now, that was a very interesting, and I'm happy, I studied at university, and even though, as I said, I'm not a Marxist, you get to study a lot of neo-Marxist where I went to school. I'm happy to give all papers that I had to read, but point being that it's a topic that we are looking at with much interest in the European Union. There are a few small-scale experiments in some member states. The main issue that we have with that, there are some, I would say, philosophical, ethical questions that have to be answered, whether it's fair to give a universal basic income, including to people who are already very rich, by the way, because if it's universal, it's universal. Right. And the problem that we see right now, it doesn't mean that it's not a possibility. These experiments are very difficult to scale.
Okay, questions? Anybody like to jump in?
We answered everything.
If you don't ask fast, we're going to keep talking.
Yes.
What was that surprising thing? Did we get that? The most surprising thing in your McKinsey panel. Remember, you said there was the most
specialization.
Yeah.
The specialization.
I'm sorry.
thing.
The most surprising thing in the
we talked
McKinsey
about the
meeting last week, or was
the-
something Deanna said, and I was.
It's the point that work is fragmenting and becoming so specialized that,
Got it.
that
That's
the
the
very
driver.
nature of work lends itself to task-based work rather than
Thank you.
job-related work. There's a question over here.
That one? Curious about the future of, I'm just curious about the future of law firms, in your opinion.
We're paying attention.
Yeah. Well, there's a platform called Up Council, and there are a few others that are starting
We have
to.
a platform for that, is the answer.
This is my answer to all questions. But if you think about the way that law is organized today, it's one of those professions where it's not as deeply entrenched in the full-time employment model or in the sort of the linking of tasks together into a giant corporation as many other professions. Consulting, accounting, sales, computer programming, all of these have those features. And so these are well positioned actually for a lot of the work to be peeled out of traditionally organized firms and into a model that is good for the individual, where the platform manages the relationships with large clients, while the individual sort of hangs up their digital shingle, so to speak, and retains a much higher fraction of the earnings that they, the earnings that they generate. This is particularly important for law because this is one of the professions that I hear really frequently in conversations about what will the new artificial intelligence technologies, where will they sort of start to substitute for human labor? And so, like, having people running their own tiny law firms rather than being suppliers of labor and talent in law seems like good insurance for the lawyers.
May I, Peter? May I?
Well, let me go
Another one, yes.
in the back there. Mike, it's heading your way. I see it.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is, like Diana said that, whether you have a job or not is not the right way to frame the discussion. I think that's good if you're, talking about policy. But if you don't have a job, that is absolutely the most important question you have to deal with. And secondly, and this is the question, the conversation has been around, New York, Chicago, LA, major metropolitan areas. But as we saw in the last election, which gave us the administration we have now, there's a whole lot of the country that is being left out. How is tech going to help the communities across rural America or even suburban America that are dying?
Yeah, yeah. Let me please double down on your first point. We haven't talked about it, but we probably should have talked about it, that in addition to sense of community, it's the importance of the sense of dignity that comes from work. And whether it's organized by showing up to an employer or it's organized by a craftsman doing their own thing. And I do think that gets linked to the whole political conversation and the anxiety that I keep coming back to. So I don't want to undermine that at all. My only issue is that my only point being that there is, I just don't buy the idea that there's a limited amount of work, even if we introduce robotics and otherwise, because I'm inspired by the notion of think about the full capacity of every mind figuring out what they're going to do on Earth. And that's, that's not limiting, but we don't have the structures to allow that to happen. We don't have the education systems that allow every child to have that opportunity. We don't have the ways to match skills with jobs that would provide more of that kind of dignity, whether it comes in the form of a traditional job or not. I think that's really important. What is technology doing? Honestly, I think technology is a double-edged sword. It's doing as much good as it's doing bad, which is why I think thinking that it's deterministic is wrong. I think citizens, consumers, voters, policy have a huge role in shaping how this goes, and I think it's high time that Silicon Valley wakes up and says, we've got to be part of this conversation.
I mean, in some ways, the use of technology in actually creating these institutions has taken the form of coding boot camps, which is like, and there's some really interesting new technologies that will give you aptitude tests and predict whether you are good for a particular profession rather than another profession when you're making the transition. But I think the key missing element, I mean, to Diana's point, is the institutional support. Okay. I mean, nobody shakes their head at you when you go to college for 4 years, and nobody says, like, listen, you're slacking off. People say you're making an investment in your future, but
your parents
you may say, and they may be right.
but when you, if you want to transition from one career to another and you need 6 months, there isn't legitimacy. There aren't institutions that give taking that time off enough financial support and legitimacy, and I think that's a key missing piece. And I will stop.
Thank you.
Now
I'm leaning because we're over time, and given the nature of the conversation this morning, I expect these topics will carry on throughout the day. So please, if you have questions, just hang on to them. There'll be another chance to ask. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you. Really good job, Peter. Andrea? Diana?
Thank you, Dave.
Arun?